I'm not scared of much. Never have been. I've been a hunter for a long time. Sounds so bold, so naked, saying it straight out like that. I've never admitted it before, not to anyone. It's been my secret little hobby for at least 16 years, ever since I pushed my husband down the stairs of our home and broke his neck. You would never have thought I had it in me back then. Not mousy little Helen, with her timid smile and quiet ways. Not the woman whose key lime pie crust got an honorable mention in the neighborhood magazine. It turns out people can be good at more than one thing. I used to come across as such a scaredy cat, never putting myself forward, never speaking up, never doing much of anything really. That never felt like me on the inside though. Looking back, I think I was just bored. Nothing interested me. I was brought up a certain way, to expect a certain life. A comfortable existence in my parents' home. Off to a nice college in a ladies' dorm to do nothing taxing, while I waited to get the only letters in my name that mattered. That all-important Mrs. Married at 21 to a boy with good prospects, tidy hair and clean underwear. A comfortable existence in his home. Got a dog, learned to make pie crust, and was all set to slide into a dull life forever. Until one day when, for no reason at all, I got so sick of his smug, self-satisfied face as he dropped another dirty tile on the hallway floor, and gave me another one of those slimy little grins when I told him to pick it up. "Sorry, honey, I forgot. Could you just drop it in the basket for me?" Famous last words. I don't know what it was about that day, that towel, that particular edition of that same shit-eating grin I had been seeing day in and day out for 3 years. But I felt a burning, red-hot rage well up inside me for the first time in my whole life. I reached out, feeling like someone else had control of my body, and I put my left hand, with the wedding ring on it shining in the morning light, over his face, and I pushed. He didn't go straight over. He paused for a moment, arms pinwheeling, shit-eating grin finally wiped off and replaced with a look of total shock, and then down he went. He landed on the marble floor of the front hall with a crack, and he never moved again. And with that one little shove, I was free. The burning red rage subsided and was replaced with a wild, fierce joy. It's a high like no other. The rush of power that comes when taking control over someone's life. I knew even as I went through the motions, talking to the police, dealing with the funeral home, hugging his whimpering mother and promising that we would stay close. All that BS. I knew I would have to do it again. And I got my chance sooner than I thought. His mother had phoned me. She wanted to spread his ashes together. Just a lonely old woman with no family left. Son taken too young in a horrible accident. Why wouldn't she just jump in the river? I practically did her a favor. Of course, I couldn't just keep pushing people I knew. I'm not an idiot, but I found my moments. From a railway bridge on a hike, a lone walker stopped to chat to the first person he had seen in a while. On a darkened street, a drunk young lad tried to pick me up and got a car in the face instead. In the subway in New York, I didn't even see it properly. That one was a rush, right in the middle of a crowd of people, but I got away with it. I've pushed maybe 25 people in 16 years and I've never regretted a moment of it. About every 6 months, I'll get that urge and I'll find an out-of-the-way place, a quiet time, and I'll wait. Someone will come along. Someone always does. And last night was no exception. There's a gully in the park that I've had my eye on for a while. It leads to a flood outlet pipe and it's fenced off normally. But in the last few months, a storm had knocked down part of the fencing, leaving a gap. Really, it's city maintenance's fault. If they would just come out and fix it, the feeling might have passed. but instead, that gap started to draw my eye, itching away at me. I couldn't stop seeing that empty space where a fence should be, like a missing tooth. Eventually, I had to take the plunge, so to speak. It was after 6. The sun had already set and there were even fewer people around than there would normally be. A little pandemic bonus for me. I waited by the gap for a likely person to come by. It was freezing cold and damp. Perfect slipping weather, but no fun to wait in. Luckily, it wasn't more than a half an hour or so before someone stumbled by. She was older, maybe 70 or so, and carrying a couple of shopping bags, obviously cutting through the park to save time. I wondered why no one was doing her shopping for her in these times, but it boded well for me if she had no close friends or family. I hurried up, a look of concern on my face. Hello, I'm sorry to bother you, but can you help me? There's a gap in the fence and I think someone's fallen down. There's something at the bottom. She looked confused and hesitated, but I gave her no time to think as I pressed on. I think I can reach them, but I'm worried about slipping myself. If you could just come keep an eye on so if I fall, there's someone there that'll be able to call for help. She relaxed a little when she realized I didn't want her to really do anything much, and she followed me over to the gully. Don't you think we should call the police, love? She asked as I swept her along with me. We will, but I just want you to check it out first. I don't want to cause a fuss if it turns out to be a couple of old rags and a funny-looking bush, I replied. We were at the gap now. The excitement was starting to build in me, that bubbling feeling in the pit of my stomach, sending thrills through me. She was nearly at the edge now. It was time. Oh, your bags, I exclaimed, perhaps a bit over-dramatically. I'm not exactly Lawrence Olivier. Let me put them here for you so you don't slip over. I took the nearest one and I rested it against the fence, taking the excuse to step behind her. I smiled encouragingly, took a step and I shoved. Her eyes went wide and her hands flew out as she went over. The other bag, still in her hand, arched up and over, scattering its contents over the gully as it dropped. That familiar thrill, breathtaking in its sharp, vicious joy, filled me again, sending my blood rushing through my veins, pulse thundering in my ears. I closed my eyes to savor the moment. When I opened them again, I looked down at the gully. The old woman was crumpled at the bottom. A splash of red on the edge of the outlet pipe marked where she had cracked her head as she had landed. I went back to where I had left the other bag and I picked it up, ready to cast it down on top of her. She had looked like she had slipped in the dark, just stumbled the wrong way, easy. But she was still alive. In the dim light, I could see her struggling feebly. Either I had misjudged the gully being shallower than I thought, or she was tougher than she had looked. My gut twisted in a sudden knock of fear. I've never made a mistake like this before. It's always been one push and done. The fall is steep enough or dangerous to kill outright, and if I think it might take a while, I only risk it in the most remote places, somewhere that I can watch them go and be sure I'll be undisturbed. Not in a public park, however big or empty. Stupid broken fence. I threw the shopping bag anyway, perhaps in the dumb hope that she had been buying something heavy, but the groceries just bounced off the pipe and landed next to her. The noise seemed to rouse her a little. She looked hazily around the ditch that she lay at the bottom of the gully, and then she looked up and seemed to freeze. Though it was too dark and too far to see properly, I felt a chill run through me, and I knew that her eyes were fixed on me. Push her, the hiss came floating up from the dark below. You pushed me. I looked around. No one had come by yet, but my luck couldn't hold out forever. I leaned into the gap and scrabbled around in the mud on the sides of the hole, looking for a rock or something that I could use. Pusher. Murderer. I found something. I had to kneel on the edge and use both hands to pry it out. It was so heavy. I lifted it and got to my feet. I only had one shot at this. I took careful aim. How would you like it if someone pushed you? I threw the rock. The rest was silence. After a moment or two to catch my breath, I surveyed the scene. The dark was rising and it was hard to see in the gully, but I could see enough to tell that she was done. The mud was a little more scuffed about than it should be, but I thought that it would pass, especially if the damp turned to rain. My clothes were filthy though. I needed to get to my car before anyone saw me. I had left it on a side road near the park. I walked quickly, coat clutched around me to hide the worst of the mud. As I reached it, I pulled out my keys and got in as fast as I could. It was only when I was in my seat, hands on the steering wheel, that I let out a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. My journey home was uneventful as ever. I pulled into the garage and sat for a moment in the dark, closing my eyes. In all the panic, I hadn't really had a chance to enjoy my moment, and I wanted to take a minute to embrace that feeling, to scratch my itch. Pusher! My eyes snapped open. I looked around, but the space was empty, just a figment of my imagination. I got out of the car and started toward the door when something flickered in the corner of my eye. I turned and peered into the corner. There was something, a shape. I stepped towards it and the shadow shifted, revealing nothing but an old overall of Jack's, my husband's, hanging on a peg next to his car tools. I walked into the house, shaking my head. For a moment, the way the shadows played across the fabric had made a shape, I told myself. It was just the stress of the night, just a coincidence how for a moment it had looked just like his face. I slept better that night than I had for a while, but for some reason, maybe my leftover jumpiness, I kept the bedroom light on. I woke up the next morning, rested and surprisingly cheery. The itch was gone and I had chores to do. I was supposed to be baking a cherry custard slice for the neighborhood charity bake sale, and I needed to go through the sales figures from my store before my tax return was due. On the whole, I considered it seemed more like a cake day than an accountancy day. So I checked that my shopping list app was up to date, headed down the step to the garage and I got in the car. I pressed the button on the door remote and a crack of light began to creep across the dark concrete, widening as the metal door began its slow roll upwards. I was looking in the mirror, tracking the door's movement when I saw her, standing in the shadowy corner of the garage, unmoving, just staring at me. My mother-in-law. Her hair was slick with water from the river, her features sterner than I had ever seen them in my life. She had been a pretty silly woman, to be honest. Her eyes glittered as she fixed them on me. I held her gaze, frozen in place as the garage door rolled upwards. As the light crawled up her body, the image melted away, leaving only a stack of old newspapers for recycling. But her face never changed. I held her eyes until the last moment, even as the slow-moving light was turning her image back into nothing more than the rubbish stacked up in a dusty corner. The impression of her eyes never wavered. I gunned the engine and backed out too quick, nearly knocking over my own mailbox in a hurry to get outside. At the store, I managed to relax a little in the hustle and bustle of other people. Too much time on our own in this pandemic, I told myself. We've all reached a breaking point. And then suddenly, I noticed a man not too far away from me. He was standing still in between two shelves, not caring if people walked too close to him. The shadow of the shelf cast an odd tint to his face. He looked vaguely familiar, I thought to myself as I caught his eye. Dressed for a hike, he had a heavy-looking backpack on, with one of those metal bottles hanging out the side. It had clanged loudly, I remembered. when he hit the stones below the old railway bridge. I had been worried for a moment that someone would hear. His lips curled into a humorless smile and he mouthed a word to me. Pusher. I dropped my basket where I stood and made for the exit, trying not to run but walking as fast as I could. I had my eyes fixed on the car as I scurried across the parking lot. I pulled my keys out of my pocket, but my nervous fingers fumbled, and they flew out of my hands and landed under the door. I dropped to my knees and reached for them. A girl lay in the darkness under the car, 20-ish, a college student type with her hair in a messy side bun. I didn't recognize her. She saw my confusion and grinned wildly, her hand slowly creeping towards me as I crouched on the tarmac of the parking lot, unable to move or look away. How would you like it if someone pushed you? I looked at her flannel shirt and suddenly I knew. I remembered the back of it as hidden in a crowd, with no idea of who I was pushing, just unable to resist the thrill. Ma'am? A voice behind me broke the spell. One of these store clerks, probably on shopping cart duty. I snatched my keys from the girl's reaching fingers and I jumped in my car, blasting out of the parking lot. In my rearview mirror, I could see the clerk, looking more than a little confused at the way that I had left him. There was no one on the ground next to him. I parked my car on the drive. No way I was facing the garage again. As I reached the doorstep of the house, I paused, unable to make myself open it. The lights were off, and although it was daylight outside, the house would still be full of shadows, waiting. I steeled myself. This had to stop, I told myself. Whatever it was, adrenaline, nervousness, hell, maybe even guilt arriving 16 years too late, I had to get a grip. There are no such things as ghosts. I opened the door and felt around the doorway for the light switch to banish those shadows and my stupid fears. I had just reached the edge of the plastic square and a hand closed over mine. It was her, strong for a 70-year-old dead woman. Her face seemed almost merry as she gripped my fingers in a freezing cold hand. Pusher. I screamed and slammed my other hand down on the switch. She disappeared as the lights came on. I bolted into the hallway and ran for the stairs, intending, I don't know what, to throw myself under my covers and hide, I guess. As I neared the top, a figure materialized in the shadow of the upstairs hallway. Her again, standing where I had stood on the day that started it all, when a smug grin had sent me down the fast track to hell. Her hand reached out, grasping for me, waiting for me to be within reach so she could. I tried to back up, but as I had reached the downstairs hall again, I stopped in my tracks. Every doorway was open, every curtain was closed. In every room, a different face looking out from the dark, angry, accusing, cold, mocking. Whispers came to me from the shadows. Pusher. I made a run for it. I got myself to a motel and managed to stammer out to the clerk that I wanted a room, while a young man's face stared at me from the shadows behind his head. I insisted on a room on the ground floor so there would be no stairways, no shadowy corners with cold hands reaching out. I got the clerk to go in first and turn all the lights on, and that's where I am now. I drew the curtains when dusk came so I wouldn't see them, but I can hear them outside the window. I don't know what to do. I'm not asking for anyone's pity. I made my choices and I don't really feel bad about them even now. I just don't know how to get out of this. I can't even sleep under the covers. I lifted the blanket and Jack was there, waiting with that same stupid grin on his face. 16 years later and I still wanted to shove it in. Only I didn't think this time that I was going to do the shoving. I can't live like this. They're everywhere, waiting for me, waiting for a staircase, a gap in traffic, even a slippery bathtub. Just waiting, looking for the opportunity, itching to push.